in a previous video, I said that the way theologians come to describe what God is, what is God's being, to be, to being, is through his attributes. So, God's not like a stuff that you can go and grab or you can immediately see. Just because he's invisible doesn't mean that there isn't a consistent set of ways to describe what he is, what he is. And so the way scholars to describe what is God and what is not God is through the attributes. What are the attributes that make up, another way of saying is, what are the attributes that make up God's divine essence? That what make God's stuff his godness, to put it that way. Or another way of putting it is, what are the essential attributes of God's very deity, his very divinity? It's the attributes apart from which he is not God, apart from which he is not his divine being. And so, as I said to you, there are two main categories. There are the communicable attributes and the incommunicable attributes. And I want to go to that in the Westminster Confession of Faith. So in that portion, so let's take a look at that. Let me go there. So this is Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 2. There are only 3 parts, but it's a doozy, right? These 2 paragraphs are huge and tremendous. And I guess the doctrine of the Trinity wasn't powerfully controverted in the 1600s. They didn't feel the need to have a long discussion there. But these 2 are packed. So in discussing the attributes of God's being, let's go to chapter 2 of God and of the Holy Trinity, point 1. So 2.1, here we go. It says, there is but one only living and true God who is infinite in being and perfection. Infinite in being and in perfection. He's infinite, he's perfect, he's infinitely perfect. Those are parts of his attributes. He is a most pure spirit. He is invisible. He is without parts, body, parts, or passions. Let me say a little something about passions. Today in late modernity, when we usually hear the word passion, we usually mean an intensity of emotion. And so a lot of people think he's without passion. You mean he's like kind of like a robot or something? That's not what it means. That's not what this is saying. Passions in the 1600s was always a negative word. It doesn't mean an intense emotion. What it means a disordered emotion, an emotion, and a feeling, a desire that is out of order. It's inordinate. It's either too much, too little. It's disordered. So unlike us, and of course we are filled with passions in the 16th century, we're disordered desires and emotions, but God does not. So he's invisible, without parts, without body, without parts, unlike us, we have parts, or passions. He's immutable, which means his very essence, his attributes, who he is, his being doesn't change, right? He's immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, most wise, most holy, most free, most absolute. Let me just stop for a moment here. Among these, a lot of these they fall into the category of incommunicable attributes. These are only of God. Only God can have these attributes. Or another way theologians have talked about is these are only of the Creator. Of course, only God is the Creator. And everything that is not Creator is created, and they call us creatures. If you are a creature isn't a furry little animal. You and I are creatures, okay? But so from a theological language point of view, there's creator, and he has attributes. And then there's creature. So angels are creatures. You and I are creatures. Of course, the furry little animals are creatures. Everything that is created is creature. And they do not have any of these attributes. They are not infinite. They're not perfection. They're not infinite in perfection. They're not a most pure spirit. Invisible, without body, parts, or passions. Now, here are some of the incommunicable attributes: immutable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty. Another way of putting it is omnipotent, right? That's a more common language, right? Let's see. Working all things according to the counsel of his own immutable and most righteous will for his own glory. Now, here's some of these other attributes. Most loving, gracious, merciful, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Now, are those things you and I can have? Yes. That's why they're called the communicable attributes. God can, they're attributes that can be communicable to the creature. And these are attributes that human beings are capable of. Some non-human beings are capable, as angels are capable, and then of course some animals are even capable of being loving or merciful. But these are the attributes, and they especially have to do with God's character. And so I want to just stop here and make a comment. This is a really important piece to understand something that cuts to the heart of Christianity, of how Christianity looks at the world, and how it looks at reality. We often hear about sin. And so often, especially here in the 21st century, sin is often considered, some religious people came along and they forbid certain kinds of activity. And if you do those activities, you broke the rules and you're a bad person. So they tend to think that sin is primarily about rules and legalisms. But actually, sin is about something deeply, profoundly disordered inside the human mind, heart, and desires and will. And when we look at the book of Genesis, you know what we see? The core sin which made Adam and Eve fall was to disobey God's command not to touch or eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it wasn't because that fruit was, I don't think it was anything particularly special about it. By the way, we don't necessarily know it was an apple. It might have been a pear. It might have been a banana for all we know. But what was important is that it was forbidden. And it's a line. And that line drew a principle, which is, this is of God and you are of the creature. You are made by God. Will you obey and trust God to be God? And when Adam and Eve violated that command, they weren't just eating fruit. They weren't just eating fruit. They were choosing to not let God be God. They were grasping after an order of understanding and of command as only God can give. And so what is going on here? When human beings, and ever since the fall, human beings essentially have grasped after the power of God, or another way of putting it is, regularly we covet and desire the incommunicable attributes of God, the godness of God. Instead, God made us to be like him. We are made in his image. And how did he want us to image him? Primarily, did he want us, was he intending to make us almighty? He certainly didn't make us invisible, and he certainly didn't make us infinite. We are clearly very finite, but he did intend us to be most loving, gracious, merciful, abundant in goodness and truth, forgiving iniquity. He wanted us to be like that. And that's exactly what we chose not to be. And regularly, what ails the world is that we are trying to be like God and get rid of God by replacing God in power, instead of humbly seeking to be God, like God, in his communicable attributes, which is what he intended, and thus be like God in his character. So I want to just stop here, because that's a big, this is an important, subject matter. And I want you to just see that there are these two big categories of the incommunicable attributes and the communicable attributes. And I want you to begin to see here, just start to wrap your mind around things that God is almighty, he is omnipotent, or other attributes that maybe that the confession didn't say, but I've been considered inside of the book of things like omnipresent, The confession used the term immense, which I think also is a very similar idea, although the vocabulary is slightly different. And I want you to think about a being that has all these categories: infinite, perfect, infinite imperfection, omnipotent, eternal, omnipresent. And even as he reigns, he doesn't reign from outside of himself. It's always done according to everything of his divine, immutable will and knowledge and essence of goodness. So it's always, and in this sense, it's coming from him. He doesn't have to look, and he doesn't have to reference or learn goodness from somebody else. He doesn't have to look and try to figure out, let me decide, is this good? Is this wise? No, he's all wise of himself, and perfectly all wise, and infinitely all wise. And he's always good and true and wise in his power. And his power is always in his goodness. And it's always infinite, and it's always unchanging. These, we can't even really quite wrap our mind in a person who has these attributes, this kind of a being. And if there's a being like this, how could you, is there a way we can reason to this being, that we could get to know it? I mean, there's the debates throughout history where philosophers and theologians have thought that human beings could try to reason to what could be of God. But I want to say, if you look at the history of religions and the history of philosophy, human beings haven't ever been able to reason to a God like this. That there is a God who has all of these perfections of attributes. The Greeks didn't have gods like any. No, they never thought there was a God like this. The Norse never had a God like this. The Chinese, they never had a God like this. They thought that if there were supposed to be perfections, some of the Greeks thought there could be eternal perfections, but they never saw it in a being, in a being, and certainly not in a person, a personal being. And only in the Bible did we begin to have a revelation of a God like this. So here we go. All of these attributes of a God whose very being and his attributes are so far beyond how we can imagine, and even how human beings have ever even imagined there could be. And so how do we come to think and see a God like this? Because the Bible told us so. Because the Bible revealed this is who God says, this is who God is. This is who I am. The central content of the Bible, of the Holy Scriptures, is God. It's always God. God is the central content at the beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't matter if you read the Bible and it's not primarily talking about God. You know what? The subject matter is still God. You know why? Because when the God is telling you, here's wisdom in the world, and it seems to be telling you something about, say, parenting, or telling you something about justice, it is from God. It is still ultimately revealing and showing us who God is. How do we get to know God? He reveals himself. We cannot grasp after it. We cannot reason to him. We cannot intuit to her. We can't use all our powers to figure him out. No, his being is so far above us that he had to come and show himself to us. He had to make a way to us. And the way he did that was through word. So brothers and sisters, just think about especially the incommunicable attributes of God, and how unbelievably immense and tremendously great he is, and how even incomprehensibly great he is, that you can't even really wrap your mind around his being. And thus, apart from a word, how would we ever truly know him? This is why Scripture is absolutely necessary.